Good evening, friends, and welcome to another episode of Tim Kirby Russia, slightly sick edition. That's why you can't see my neck. But Zinderneuf is not sick. We can see his neck. He is functioning. He is not the victim of some potentially engineered plague like I am as of today. And you know why, Zinderneuf, why I invited you on the program today is I really enjoyed our last discussion. That's one thing. But as I was watching the sort of the events happened recently in Kursk while I was super ultra busy. I really went to your channel over and over and over again. East calling is what it's called on Telegram. East calling, that's important. And to get the real lowdown on what's happening. So I thought, why not just have you on the show? Because you really were able to follow the whole collapse of Kursk that happened over this last few weeks very in depth, very impressively. So the first question I have for you from the interviewer to interviewee side of things is, why did this happen so fast? Is this really like a Donald Trump froze something or the USAID exposure? Why did this sort of wait, then break? Or is it just a natural thing that happens? A bridge is made badly and then one day it collapses. Is it natural or did Trump have something to do with it?
Well, I don't think Trump had as much to do with it as a lot of people suspect. I was following the situation before Trump made that announcement to withdraw security assistance and intelligence sharing with Kiev. And I think it was a couple of weeks ago, we did a stream on our channel where I was talking about the real breaking point was when the Russian forces gained fire control, mainly through artillery, over the main access for the Ukrainian forces into Kursk. That highway, I believe, the H07 highway, which turns into the R200 highway when you cross the border. They gained fire control over that highway probably about over 2 weeks ago now. And because the thing about artillery is it has to sit a certain amount of distance behind the front line in order to avoid the counter battery, or at least minimize losses due to counter battery. So Russian artillery, the bulk of Russian artillery, because obviously Russian weapons, they have really long distance weapons, but I'm talking about the bread and butter, basic foundation of the Russian military is some of those artillery systems that have a range of like 30 kilometers.
Yeah, the kind of artillery cannon you picture in your mind when you see from World War II or World War One, the guys crew it. They eject the shell, shove into one end, close it, shoot, repeat, over and over again. That kind of artillery, right?
Right. And that artillery for safety needs to be like 12 to 15 kilometers behind the line of contact. And it has about a 30-kilometer range. That's sort of its optimal accuracy point. Further than that, it becomes less accurate. But basically, once Sverdlikovo and a couple other places fell, the Russian artillery was able to get close enough to just hammer that main access for the Ukrainian forces into Kursk. And that's when things really started to accelerate. It started in the north, and it started moving further south, and the Russians, while the Ukrainians were making counteroffenses towards the northeast and the east and southeast, the Russians were working on that western portion of the bulge, Sverdlikovo, and also crossing the border into Sumy slightly in a couple areas as well to get close enough to that main line of logistics. And that's really that was the beginning of the end for the Ukrainian forces in Kursk. And it accelerated after that, once they got close enough to also use the fiber optic FPV drones more effectively on that main line of logistics. And basically they just hammered the Ukrainians to the point where they were in a weak spot. But even long before this point, I mean, the Ukrainians reached their maximum extent into Kursk last September. And by November, it was pretty clear that they were just in a slow retreat from then on. And so, yeah, and then once they gained fire control over the Ukrainian lines of logistics, I think the Ukrainians realized that this was just a lost cause and basically just kind of folded.
So, okay. So then the thing is on the map we saw that there was this sort of move from the south, and now the Ukrainians' forces are somewhat encircled. They're sort of trapped on the Kursk side of the border, completely surrounded on all sides, and that's why, like, Donald Trump even asked Putin to spare their lives, this, that, and the other. Now, is this connected to the guys going through the gas pipeline? Because Zinderneuf, I believe that guys went through a gas pipeline. I don't think that that
Mm,
was made up, but when I think about in terms of military history, I'm like, how many guys could have gone through that pipe? How could that have really
mm,
been such a big maneuver? Or am I mixing up two different things? So, what is this? And was it really going through that pipeline that it created them
mm,
being surrounded, or is that just something that was very media friendly? And yeah, maybe it was a success, but maybe it wasn't as much of a success as the media likes because it's very visual.
mm,
The guys going through this toxic pipe,
mm.
the breathing horrific air to triumph over the enemy. It's visually interesting.
Well, right. Well, I mean, I kind of got my head bit off a little bit for reporting on that a little early by my partner that I work with.
Mm.
Because at first there was that confusion over, is this real? Is this propaganda? Did it actually happen? And basically, everyone I know who's a little closer to Russian media and all of that, I think they really wanted to wait on reporting on that. And I think a lot of channels started reporting on it too early before anyone really knew the results. So there was a lot of
Mm.
that's what led to the confusion. Is I think they wanted people to kind of not really talk about it as much, keep it a secret.
Mm.
Um, but to your question, I think that it's important to recognize what happened in Kursk was a large orchestrated operation, and
Yeah.
it was a smaller part of a larger operation. I don't think that one event on its own would have led to the collapse of the Ukrainian forces in Suja that we witnessed, not by a long shot. Ultimately, it was part of a larger operation where everyone played their part. And the men who went through that pipe, I mean, the translation for it is like the person, not the Russian counterpart on my channel, keeps calling it Operation Stream. Everyone
Mm.
else seems to call it Operation Pipe. I don't
Well,
speak
no,
Russian, so
I
I can't
think
really.
that stream is the right translation because it's like
Mm,
sarcastic. I don't know if I forget what they called it, like stream, like in English, because all the pipelines, the more newer pipelines, were called like Severny Patok, like the North Stream pipeline.
mm,
So I think it's like a sarcastic reference to that, but
mm.
I wouldn't be surprised if it was called something else on like their computers because you don't want to give secret operations a very figure outable name.
Mm.
But anyways.
Right. And it's important, like I was saying, this was part of a larger operation. I mean, because there is no universal soldier who can make everything happen, and no small group of soldiers. I mean, the soldiers who took part in this operation are legitimate heroes. I
Yeah.
mean, they were part of brigades that were referred to as guards brigades. For example, the elite units of the 800th and 810th Guards Marine Brigades were involved. You don't get that title of guards applied to your brigade unless you've already done something very heroic. Like
Mm-hmm.
you have to have really accomplished some great feat to be have that applied to your brigade by the Russian leadership. So these men were incredibly courageous, and also it's been pointed out that we probably won't know the full effect and the full results of this operation until long after the SMO is complete.
Yeah.
There's a lot of chatter and a lot of talk about exactly what happened. On the Western side of things, if you went to Twitter the day it happened, the trending Twitter headline was that it was a complete failure. The Ukrainian forces immediately bombed them all when they left the pipe.
Mm-hmm.
But then the next day on Twitter, the headline was Russians sneak through pipe, surround Ukrainian forces in Suja.
Yeah.
So it's like even the Western press isn't sure whether it was successful or not.
Oh, interesting. And I just like to
Right.
point out on the terms of like the heroism level is Like as someone who plays pro American football in Russia, I can tell you one thing is we do a lot of drills to stay low. You know, you come off the line of scrimmage and you want to stay low, and that's like 10 feet. You know, these guys went a few kilometers because the pipe is only like a meter and 40 tall. The average adult
Mm.
is what, 178 centimeters. So it's that height where
Mm.
you're basically like an offensive lineman staying low, but for over a kilometer, and because it's curved, your ankles are going to be always pushed the wrong direction the whole way there. So I think the really
Mm.
impressive thing is after they did that, I'm not quite sure. I've heard also conflicting reports about the quality of the air they were breathing in the pipe. But you get out of that
Mm.
pipe, and everything has to just hurt. Your entire
Right.
body, maybe except for your arms, your neck, your back, your knees, your ankles had to be on fire. And it's like, okay, go fight. So, yeah, that is
Right.
definitely quite an accomplishment for those guys who actually did that.
And it's important to point out, I mean, these guys were carrying like 30 kilograms of equipment.
That too.
Yeah, on top of all of that,
Yeah.
full armor and all of that. And most people couldn't endure these kind of conditions for 15 minutes. And I think that and also this was kind of like, storming the beaches at Normandy to a certain extent.
Mm.
Imagine being like the first person to get off the Higgins craft, on that beach.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it basically, these men went into this operation knowing, there was a good chance they weren't coming back. And I mean, we've seen pictures of, people getting treatment, people who were evacuated after the operation.
Hmm.
And they were just the spearhead. I mean, you can imagine there was, more people who went through as well. And all of this happened while forces were attacking the Ukrainians in the general area as well. And like I said, this was part of a larger operation.
Yeah.
And so they contributed, significantly to that collapse of the Ukrainian lines by moving behind the lines, being a combination of strike force and also a distraction, and also something adding to the confusion and chaos within the Ukrainian
Yeah.
ranks. Um,
I could be a bit ignorant as someone who isn't a military expert in any sense of the
mm,
word, but recently I just had a conversation with a Western person that wanted to join the Russian military, and I told him, man, if you're gonna do this, don't try to become a scout and don't try to join the assault brigades. You're not gonna make
mm.
it, man, because this action, like basically what they did, combined like the scout work with assault work, which are like the two deadliest, hardest things. I don't know how anyone can do it, but some guys
Mm.
can, man. So,
Yeah, it's not for tourists.
uh,
Definitely not.
no.
Mm.
Wow. All right. And now, how did Kiev react to these moves by the Russians? So essentially, this is a question I've kind of asked a lot of guests. So our regular
Mm.
viewers, they exist, uh, might have
Mm.
heard me ask many times: is why does Kiev always allow itself to get surrounded, even during like the sort of pre-war anti-terrorist operation, for using Kiev's terminology for it in the Donbass? The Russian side or pro-Russian side always was able to surround Kiev's forces at some point and then blast them, and it happens
Mm.
over and over and over again, and it happened yet again. How did they not see this coming? Why were they unable to deal with being surrounded?
I think they had to have seen this coming, and I think that, like I said, since November, it's been a long, slow retreat that then just happened all at once. And I think that, for Kiev, I mean, I can't read their minds, but I do think that they care a lot about the PR, which is why the Kursk offensive happened in the first place. Their incursion into Kursk, and they don't seem to care about the loss of their men. Sadly enough, to evacuate them when the time is right. I mean, I will
Mm,
say that, a lot of people were very critical of the Russians for their retreat from Kherson and Kharkov in the beginning of
mm-hmm.
it, back in 2022. But I think it was definitely the right choice strategically, as well as to save the lives of your men in that situation.
Yeah.
The Ukrainian forces, the leadership just doesn't seem to really care about the lives of their men like that, which I find incredibly. egregious, and it always surprises me as well that they seem to allow their forces to sit in a cauldron for as long as possible.
Well, yeah, but the thing
You
is,
know.
but by what logic? Because okay, I definitely know a lot of people who are very emotional in their thinking, and I could see that someone who is not practical and it just thinks in feelings like, oh my God, just leave them there. They can't give this up. If we give this up, it'll be a disaster. We can't give up, and they don't have this like chain of reasoning that, well, if you allow them to be destroyed, then you've essentially lost the opportunity to defend something else or take this thing back or something. But we're talking
Hmm.
about men who graduated from military academies here. I thought Sirsky actually was like, was he old enough to be in the Soviet army? Like the same
Hmm.
military academy that the guys he's fighting against went to. You know, like,
Hmm.
I don't get it. Or do you have no.
Well, so I would say that as much as we question why someone would allow themselves to be surrounded or have people in a cauldron like that, there's also some other tactical considerations. There's something called the War of Interior Lines, which was
Mm,
common with Napoleon and also the Germans in World War One, where a lot of people look at a map and they think that, well, if you're surrounded or you're getting caught in a pincer movement, you're done. Napoleon took a different approach where he believed that one central force has the advantage against two separate approaching forces.
mm-hmm.
Because you think about it, you can move men and equipment from, if you're inside a cauldron, from one end of that cauldron to the other much more quickly than your enemy can move men and equipment from one end of that cauldron around the circle to
Mm,
the other
mm-hmm.
end. And so there's that certain amount of maneuverability when you're in a central location and your enemy has to operate around you.
Yeah.
um and then there's also another consideration of, well, if you look at back through military history in the Middle Ages, where you had this ever increasing preponderance of heavy men at arms, cavalry, knights on horseback, what was found out was the way you stop that heavy cavalry charge is by standing your ground. It's by
Well, yeah.
standing and fighting, and you can break that cavalry charge if you stand and fight. Which is why the Native Americans had such a problem with fighting Europeans on horseback, because they would see those horses coming at them and they would immediately break ranks and run.
And then they get
Having a
run
force.
down. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's where you would have like 200 men destroy an opposing force of like 50,000.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
crazy numbers like that. But if you stand your ground, you can break that cavalry charge. So there is some tactical. I'm not saying like the Ukrainian force is just completely illogical. Like their
Mm-hmm.
leadership
Yeah.
just has no idea what they're doing.
Yeah, well, that sounds to
Um,
be a little bit like an outdated logic, because in a world
mm,
of all these rockets and bombs and especially artillery shells, as you mentioned before, holding doesn't really seem to have the same effect. It's
it,
not a Napoleonic battle, that's for sure.
right, right. Well, and it's a cyclical nature of warfare where, and there's also, I guess, another consideration of what the Ukrainian leadership might be thinking as well. I mean, even if your lines of logistics are getting hammered, you can do a calculation of like, okay, 10% of whatever we send down that road to support our forces is going to get blown away. Are we comfortable with that? Can we
Uh,
still say, well, 90% got through and that's good enough? 80% got through and that's good enough.
mm-hmm.
Um, can we spread out, like, so instead of sending in equipment in a convoy, if we have like a vehicle and then a couple kilometers back another vehicle and a couple of that can minimize losses going through. It slows down your logistics dramatically, but you can still get men and equipment through that line.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of their logic is that if they just gave up territory without shoving men and equipment into these cauldrons, they would have all, Russian soldiers would probably be already marching on Kiev. And I think
Oh.
that,
Well, why
you
would
know,
that be? Because they would just give up and keep losing territory every day, or because the army would just break, or there'd be some sort of schism within the government or military or something like that?
Both, and the PR, the losing of face would dramatically affect morale as well, because they
Mm.
can always not talk about their losses, and we know that they lie about their losses and things like that. So they can always just lose men and equipment and say, "Well, the Russians are moving slowly. Look how slowly they're moving." And it's
Yeah.
like, without telling everyone that they're shoving men and equipment into these grinders and just losing it like crazy. As long as the men and equipment keep coming, they can keep it up.
Mm. I see. Very
Mm,
dark, yet extremely interesting. Okay,
mm.
this is something where I'm going to take the first question I asked you, but one piece of it and remix it. So, has Trump's moves, his actions as president, have they changed anything in the war in Ukraine? The whole thing, anywhere, in any way, or has it made
Mm.
zero difference?
Well, I can imagine it's had a morale effect. If we're talking specifically about the pause on equipment and intelligence sharing, well, we know the Ukrainians had several months worth of equipment in storage, like 3 to 6 months, depending on what kind of equipment and ammunition you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So it would have taken a long time for that to have an effect. And as far as the intelligence sharing goes, I believe it was reported that, well, they definitely need the American intelligence to aim, like satellites and all of that, to aim the HIMARS, for
Yeah.
example. Well, there was actually a HIMARS strike fairly deep into Russian territory, just at the very end of that period when the United States cut off intelligence sharing,
Mm-hmm.
and they broadcast that they did this with French satellites, and they used,
Oh.
so I
Mm.
think the intelligence sharing would have caused a lot of the lack of intelligence sharing would have caused a lot of rot over time. I think that pause in sharing equipment and intelligence was not long enough to really make a big impact.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it really had much of an impact on anything. Um, but I do think that the Trump administration has caused a strong negative morale effect for Ukrainian forces. And it's also caused some discombobulation of intelligence and supplies. But because so much of that was showing up until recently, even with some interruptions, it's not really having a big effect yet.
Well,
But
yeah.
I do think that over the months we'll start seeing, even with the continuation of sharing equipment and intelligence, if it becomes more haphazard and more unexpected pauses and breaks and things like that, there will be a bit of a deterioration in the strength of the Ukrainian forces moving forward because of that.
Well, yeah, because I even heard that even if they lost all support, they are still sort of 3 to 6 months ahead on supplies. If
Mm,
they continue fighting at the same pace, it's kind of a paradox because on the one hand you hear, well, the Russians shoot 20 shells for every one shell they have, but they can still
mm.
consistently shoot that 1 to 20 or 1 to 10 or whatever the ratio is for the next few months. So that way, so basically, we're not that close to the end of this thing unless
Mm.
something magical happens, which is very sad.
Right. Well, and that's just it too. I mean, the Ukrainians are fighting a war of defense while the Russians are fighting a war of offense.
Mm.
And defense is, uh, it's generally harder to be on the offensive.
Yeah.
And I don't think that the ratio is 1 to 20 or even 1 to 10. I would say your daily average of artillery from both sides is probably about 10,000 shells for the
Mm-hmm.
Russians
Yeah.
and about 3 to 5,000 for the Ukrainians,
Mm.
depending on the month. You know,
Mm-hmm.
um, so it's not quite that stark. So it's a very hard fight for the Russian forces. I mean, let's make no mistake about that. It's not something where the Russians are going to just roll over the Ukrainian forces. It's going to be quite difficult. But we're seeing a lot of changes on the front right now. A lot of stuff getting moved around. The focus has shifted from certain parts to other parts.
Oh
I
wait,
can get more
hold
into
on.
that.
Then tell us from where to where, because this is kind of important, especially because the
Mm,
theme of our episode is what the hell happened in Kursk, basically.
mm,
So now that things have happened like this in Kursk, which is kind of on the highway to Kiev, what's
mm.
changed there? Have they sort of shifted things elsewhere, or what's going on?
The Ukrainian forces, I mean, it's been recorded that they've sent forces that were in the Kursk and Sumy direction to Pokrovsk, as well as to shore up defenses around. They've sort of hammered Touretsk quite a bit lately. They've had to reinforce defenses around Kupiansk, and it's created a shift in kind of what you're seeing happen on the battlefield. While the Russian forces, I believe, have shifted a lot to the south, the very south west Donetsk direction
Mm-hmm.
around Velikaya Novoselka, where you're seeing a lot of Russian gains there. You're seeing the Russians trying to reactivate the area around Oryahovo.
Mm-hmm.
You have, Pyatikatki recently was liberated by Russian forces. But you're seeing that like Ukrainian counterattacks around Pokrovsk,
Right.
in Touretsk, and all of that, which is helping their PR a little bit because losing Kursk is a huge wound for them.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to push back into Touretsk was sort of a major PR victory for the Ukrainians. Even though you kind of have to look at it, in Touretsk, they've moved back into the city a couple of kilometers deep, whereas you figure a couple of kilometers fell per hour in Kursk
Oh.
for the past few days.
Mm-hmm.
Um, right now in Kursk, it looks like things have settled for a moment, but there was that announcement recently that they're giving the Ukrainians till Monday to lay down their arms and surrender, or vacate, or basically it's going to be game on, no holds barred after that. I don't know how much the Russian forces are waiting for Monday.
Mm-hmm.
But Putin made that
Probably, I would
announcement.
guess not really. I think when it
Mm,
comes to that sort of stuff, especially if you're a guy on the ground, if there's something in your sights, you shoot. I think
mm,
that's what it boils down to. But
right. So
okay.
you don't get the weekend off, that's for sure.
No, no. But I think a lot of politicians, especially people who've lived their entire lives in a bureaucratic universe, unfortunately, they
Mm,
get trapped into a bureaucratic logic where they're like,
mm,
"Yeah, we'll create this ceasefire in Gaza for 9 weeks, so we can engage in X number amount of hours of negotiation," and they're already making quantities and this and that, and they forget that there's sort of a human factor involved in all of this. So, yeah,
mm,
that's another reason why I'm a big anti-bureaucracy advocate. I think it's
mm,
one of the great causes of many problems of society here. It sometimes is a solution, but more often than not,
mm.
it's a problem. So, as we're
That's a problem that everybody's grappling with. I mean, what is handled well by bureaucracy and what isn't, you know?
yeah, well,
Mm,
that's another question. Yeah, because some things maybe have to be bureaucratic. But to
mm,
be honest, the longer I live, the less I like it, or the way I want to just minimize it all. I don't know. Russia would be a good
mm,
example of it because the government here is always trying to go from that Soviet level of bureaucracy to sort of simplifying things, like the big project to make these multifunctional centers across the country. You can do all your bureaucracy. Now they want to make it pretty much all online as much as possible. So hopefully one day we'll
mm.
we'll get there. But anyways, my sort of last question for you, Zinderneuf, is have you monitored any global reactions to this event? What are people saying about this Kursk event? The pipe storm, the surrounding of the troops of Ukraine's troops, I mean, and being essentially, I don't know what you want to call it, not held for ransom, but I don't know, basically threatened with
Mm,
execution if they don't surrender. Maybe that might be a better way to phrase it.
mm.
What has been the global reaction to this?
Well, if we're talking about the media, I would say that there's multiple. I found out that I've realized over time that there's multiple levels to the media, where there's sort of like the front and center stuff that gets on broadcast television, the stuff that's like the headline. Like if you work at an office job in America, you go in, you log into your computer, it's probably going to open to something like the MSN portal that has like today's top stories, all of that.
Mm,
And then deeper than that, you have stuff like the New York Times and CNN, written news, and Washington Post, which is there, but you kind of have to look for it. And then you have the really highbrow, deep news, like the deep journalism coming from like the Atlantic or something like that, where this
Yeah.
is more for like the smarter people who know more about what's going on. So starting with that high level, that front and center level, like when I go to work and log into my computer and I see what today's headlines are, radio silence on Kursk.
Oh, we're not talking about
Yeah.
this one. All right.
Mm.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it'll literally, and when I did start to see things, it was sort of like, oh, something's happening in Kursk, or like, well, apparently the Russians are claiming that they've made some gains in Kursk or something, and like
Mhm.
as if this was something like irrelevant or not very important.
Yeah.
And then, but going into the deeper news, you would get a lot more conversation about their favorite subject, the North Koreans. This claim that North Koreans
Oh,
were
that's
instrumental.
right. Yeah, because there have been memes about that in Russian of like they'll, either use AI or Photoshop a Korean guy like coming out of a pipe and being like, I thought this was Seoul, South Korea, like stuff like that. Yeah, well,
Right.
I forget about that. It's so insane that I forget that it's even real. But yeah,
Which is interesting because the reports were that all North Koreans had supposedly left Kursk about a month and a half ago, but apparently they're back. You
they
know,
were back for this.
you're right.
Oh,
And the thing is, like, I haven't even seen a single video of supposed North Korean. They would put out these videos where they would just like show a video of some soldiers and say, "Well, their uniforms are lime green. That means they're North Koreans."
yeah.
Uh, and they're not even doing that. They're not even doing that right now. So I'm like, so where's the evidence of the North Koreans in this situation? I mean, if you were thinking like if Russia was going to send people on a dangerous mission through a pipe or like that, you think the North Koreans would be like the ideal group of people to send through there. Like if the Western narrative is that, well, they have these North Korean troops that they use as cannon fodder.
Oh, in
I
that
mean,
sense, I thought you were gonna say because they might
mm,
be slightly shorter on average. I was
no,
like, well, that's
no,
harsh, but yeah.
like
Oh,
it's like no, I wasn't going there, but
people in modern Russia are pretty tall, but yeah. Anyways,
right,
yeah.
right, but yeah, so I mean, just kind of ridiculous stuff like that. And I mean, when you get to the deep news, you do get this acknowledgement that this is pretty bad for Ukraine, that they were really hoping to use Kursk as this bargaining chip. There was this idea that they were going to trade territory in Kursk for, territory within Ukraine that the
Mm-hmm.
Russians have claimed in any kind of negotiation. And now they've lost what possibly would have been their bargaining chip. Although to me, I always looked at it as the opposite. I looked at it as like the Kursk incursion was going to guarantee that Russia didn't ever settle, because there's
Mm-hmm.
no way Russia is going to negotiate for its own territory.
Well, and this is, dude, one of the things where maybe I could add some expertise, right? We've been discussing a war. I'm not a military expert, but I can tell you I'm definitely an expert on like the media because I've worked in it for so
Mm,
long. And the idea of taking Kursk as a bargaining chip, that is like I have a strong feeling that someone in the West came up with that, or some group of people in the
mm,
West. I think that is all advisor talk of people who
mm,
don't really understand the context of anything or the consequences, and they're just looking at the situation like a blank slate. Like this could be Kenya, this could be China, this could be an island in the Pacific Ocean. It's all the fucking same. They're all Aboriginal scum, and we're just gonna do this like trick to get a better deal. So yeah,
mm.
I have a strong feeling that concept entirely came from without, as they say.
I thought it was the dumbest idea ever. And basically, this idea that it was some kind of humiliation for the Russian leadership. I mean, if anything, it just made the people within Russia who want to fight more aggressively. It
Yeah,
gave them power. I mean, because there's a war party in every country, and I think that in Russia, Vladimir Putin is the moderate.
yeah,
He's someone who is the very reasonable one, which is why I've always thought this idea of like getting rid of Putin would solve problems for the West. I thought is absolutely insane, because really he's the one of the better people to be in charge of Russia.
Hmm.
from a Western perspective, because he is moderate. He has some liberal leanings. He
Yeah.
has he takes a very long-term view of things. There's people, if they replace Vladimir Putin, we'd be seeing a Russia that would be far more reckless, far more aggressive,
Hmm.
far less forgiving to the West. You know, it wouldn't be a good thing from a Western perspective for Vladimir Putin.
Well,
Well,
yeah,
and
and
obviously
one of
not
the
from a
other
Russian
things is
perspective
even
either.
within Russian society is we also have to remember that Vladimir Putin really does actually believe in this whole Christianity stuff. And
Mhm,
one of the, I'll put it this way, I know the way that a lot of people in the West think, and it's a very Hollywood way of thinking. And what
mhm,
does a war look like when it's over in Hollywood? That's when the capital falls, when the flag falls, when this main fancy building, wherever it is taken over by the enemy. And so, if the Russians actually did want to end this war in a quick way, there's only one target, and that's Kiev. Nothing else matters. In all honesty, it doesn't matter about the Donbass. It doesn't matter about anything else. Kiev is the only real target. But
mhm,
there's sacred sites and there's monasteries that have stood for 1,000 years, and I have a strong feeling that because I've even, let's just say, gently discussed this fact, because they always ask me on these interviews, well, how do the Western think, or what's their mentality? I'm like, all that matters is Kiev in their opinion. But anyways, I think that Putin can't pull the trigger on annihilating like the cradle of Russian civilization. And I
mhm,
think that that is one of the reasons why the war looks like the way it is. And what you were saying is, well, what would be different? Say we get someone in power who does not share that opinion. I wouldn't say it
mhm,
wouldn't be a nuclear missile, but he'd just launch non-nuclear the whole effing arsenal and just be done with this shit. Because
mhm,
I believe, from what I understand, despite the fact that they're well within range of attack, the overwhelming majority of people in leadership positions are still in Kiev, which is insane.
mhm.
That's very
Sure.
they're very confident in being there, despite the fact that they have hit specific targets within Kiev.
Mhm.
So I don't know. I just think that that would be what, like you were saying, if they change leaderships, things would change. I think that would probably be one of the first things they'd get, especially if the next guy in was not religious. He'd be
Mhm.
like, "Well, monasteries are nice, but we need to win." Click.
Mhm. Right. Well, and I think that, like, people have always asked, like, well, why doesn't Russia, like, people online ask, like, well, why doesn't Russia, like, assassinate Zelensky or something like that?
Yeah.
I think ultimately it doesn't matter whether Zelensky's there or not. Getting rid of Zelensky wouldn't change anything or solve anything in the Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's no strategic benefit to that, and I think that's the way that the Russian leadership has been viewing this from the beginning. Is, they're trying to win the war strategically and
Mm-hmm.
achieve their objectives strategically, and they're not so concerned with public relations. They're really not concerned with symbolic gestures. They're
Yeah.
really not so concerned with just like things that would be emotionally gratifying for some people, like
Mm-hmm.
blowing Kiev to hell would be emotionally
Yeah.
satisfying. But it's a I'm very impressed with the way the Russian leadership just doesn't go that way.
No.
Like they're more like, how do we strategically get from point A to point B, and that's all that matters.
Yeah. Well, I was saying that they would want to do that because the Western politicians, who are very emotional, would see, they'd be like, well, the
Mm,
capital fell, it's over.
right.
Like there'd be a Saigon moment. Well, getting everyone out
Mm.
of here. Well, we're gonna call this one a day. But that's kind of what I was referring to, their mentality.
Right. Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
would also say that even from within Russia, if they were to have taken out Zelensky out of spite, well, that would have put Zaluzhny into probably power potentially. And I would say Zaluzhny is particularly respected in Russia, but he's a lot more of a man's man. And why
Mm,
would you want to trade this miniature, potentially bisexual Jewish comedian freak for someone who's at least speaks competently and is very masculine? Zaluzhny is probably insulted by this, but he's a little bit like a military kind of flavor of Putin in the way he speaks. That's very serious and the facts. Why would you want that guy in power? That's a
right.
bad thing.
Exactly. Mm.
So, yeah.
Right. Right. And yeah, I mean, and that is the way that I think the U.S. fights a lot. I mean, when you look at Iraq, where they would just hammer the hell out of, Baghdad, or, those couple of cities central to the Tigris and Euphrates, and just move in and then just, you know, kill anyone who then just descends on their location to fight them.
Yeah.
That's, more the, Western approach to, countries like Iraq, for
Yeah, yeah.
example. And so, whereas like the Russians they're actually gaining control over territory and claiming it, and then moving on to the next piece, in sort of a
Yeah.
domino
And
fashion.
actually having some concern for the people that are there. Because, again, that's why this war is the special military operation, because the United States and Iraq, they're all aboriginals. Who cares? But with
Mm,
the Russians, it's like, okay, well, we took something back. Who's still stuck here? Who's alive? Who's been murdered? The people have been murdered. We have to record all this, at least find out
mm,
who the hell are their relatives. What this building, that building, can we connect this building back to electricity and water, or do we have to knock the whole thing down? Who lives there?
mm,
It's a lot more. It's a much different approach in that way, and that's another reason probably why they don't want to blow up Kiev, is because it just creates a whole question is how many, if they were basically, unless they were able to somehow be like, look, you have 72 hours to evacuate, and we're just hitting this thing to get rid of it. Uh, there'd be a lot
mm,
of civilian deaths. And I think that that's probably another thing that Putin is concerned about, is if he did. But I think it's actually more the Christianity stuff is the real
mm,
core focus. But there would be a lot of potentially neutral people who'd get whacked by that. And that's another thing where
mm.
Zelensky, in some ways, has unlike Saddam Hussein, Zelensky has the luxury of kind of sitting behind a human shield. Where
Right,
when
right.
this war with the Russians, it's like, who are we shooting at? Are we shooting at our own people? Are we shooting at people who are kind of neutral, who don't care who rules them? Or are we shooting at our enemy? We don't even know a lot of the time. So,
And this war is very different in terms of just the media coverage. I think that, it really makes you wonder what Iraq and Afghanistan would have been like if you had this constant stream of video coming from the line of combat.
mm-hmm.
And what's happening on the ground. And it's really changed the sort of propaganda aspect of warfare, having this constant 24-hour stream of video and total documentation of everything that's happening. I mean, a lot
Yeah.
of people would be shocked to learn that, Ukraine, I'm sorry, American bombing missions in Iraq killed something like 20,000 civilians,
Mm-hmm.
and no one really knows about it. And the only thing we have to go by is reports coming out of like NGOs and stuff like
Yeah.
that, and anti-war groups. We don't have the video. We don't have all this surveillance footage. We don't have video of people talking to people on the ground about it.
Yeah. And instantly
Um,
uploading it online. Yeah.
and so the Russian forces are also very mindful of, you know, they're doing everything in front of a camera, which is also why you see people like they pass laws where it's illegal to divulge the identity of a fighter.
Yeah.
When you watch a lot of the news videos, their faces are covered up
Yeah.
because they're afraid that, 10 years from now when this is all over, someone could be assassinated by
Yeah.
say 10 years from now this is all over, and some Ukrainian finds out that this guy fought for the Russian forces in the SMO, and he shoots him in the street or
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that.
And that's why they
You
also
know,
all use their, I don't know what that'd be in English, like Pozivnoy is like nickname maybe, or I don't know,
mm,
operational name, where, so that's why everyone is like Jazz and Mickey and Lightning, and they all have these fake kind of
mm.
call sign, would that be it?
Yes,
Their
that's what I
call
do. I
signs
use,
are
yeah.
all
Mm,
yeah, these weird made up names. So
mm,
yeah. So, but I actually knew someone who was in the special forces in Russia before all this happened, and
mm,
he said that even for them, they weren't allowed to use social media for during their service, and for 5 years after it. In fact, they weren't even allowed to be
mm,
in the background of photos, which is kind of hard in the
hmm,
21st century. But yeah,
yeah.
so that's not a new policy there. But anyways,
Mm,
Zinderneuf, thank you for this fascinating discussion. I wish I
mm.
wasn't so ill, because I had a really good time, but you probably can't see it on my face, my pale,
I hope you
sick
feel
face.
better.
All right, thank you, man. And you're doing a great job. Everyone, you go to Telegram. East Calling. If you look at the description of this video, you'll see the link. But it's t.me// East Calling, written as one word and spelled correctly. I love when people spell things the correct way. Not like when they put extreme with just the letter X, then tream. That's disgusting. Thank you for calling your group using proper spelling. So anyways, any final words for the audience before we vanish?
Just, thank you everyone for watching, and I hope you enjoy your weekend. And hopefully all of this whole situation comes to a conclusion somewhat soon. And, I'm generally in favor of us returning to a situation of peace in the world.
Oh, me too, man. Me too. I may really criticize the West here and certain aspects. Well, I'll put it this way, the globalist side of the West. But I don't want people to die. I don't want there to be a war. I want this to be some sort of just intellectual
Debate.
fight. Yes, the big debate. Anyways, talk to you later, man. Tim Kirby Russia signing out.